Hello, I'm Paul Orselli, and lucky me to be joined today by Aaron Goldblatt. Hi, Aaron. How are you?
I am reasonably happy. How are you?
I'm pretty happy. And with that entree, I want to wing the stage over to you and say, Aaron, what's just one thing about exhibits you would like to share with people?
Well, when your invitation came into me, I was really caught up short because I it, it there isn't the one thing that I can't sort of occurred to me as I was chewing on this and gnashing my teeth and um, pulling my hair is actually remembering complexity. Um, Everything is always more complex than you thought it was. And I'm this has particularly been had a raking light thrown across it in this last couple of years, for all the obvious reasons. And the projects sort of go rolling through my Rolodex of projects of the last 25, 30 years is the things that have bitten me in the back, so to speak, uh, most often are when I was trying too hard to simplify, and forgetting that complexity not only is there regardless of what you want, but it actually should be celebrated. Um, and a 5-year-old can deal with complexity just as well, maybe better, than someone of my advanced age. Um, we get kind of ossified in our um, dotage, but in everything from physical phenomena to issues of race and gender and class, they're always there, those complexities, and they always need to be accounted for in one way or another, allowed for in one way or another in almost every part of every exhibit project I've ever done. I can't think of something that wasn't improved when we allowed for um, multiple ways to understand something, multiple kinds of challenges. Um, so and I think I said to you at the beginning before we started the recording that I'm always happy to obfuscate. That's kind of my
Well,
my
uh, I'm just so I appreciate you bringing up the notion of complexity, and I think that is actually one thing to think about in exhibits. But how does that, from a practical standpoint, play out in terms of your practice when you're working on projects, or if you were for somebody watching this who is an exhibit developer or an emerging exhibit developer, what does that actually mean? Okay, I get that the world is complex, but how does that play out in your practice?
well in from a exhibit development perspective, in some ways it's the easiest way to point to it, because you're in the world of ideas and the world of as opposed to the kind of physical phenomena of how does this cup work, although I can think of ways to um, problematize that too. But it, regardless of the content, um, there are so many ways to look at something, and the notion of um, maybe the most painful, certainly for me, issue specifically, and in one narrow way, is white privilege, and that white privilege, among other things, has to do with assuming that your perspective is the right one. And that in the case of being a white person, it's holding a certain amount of innate power in interpreting a thing, a phenomenon, a historic moment, and that if one stops, well, what happens if I'm looking at it from another direction? What happens if I'm looking at it from, the perspective of someone who isn't typically heard or accounted for, even if they are in your target audience, whatever that means, and taking off your hat for a moment. For those that know me, that's hard for me to do. I'm always wearing a hat, but I think it's the only way to celebrate the depth of any content.
Well, and I think one thing I often say to my graduate students in exhibition design is there's never just one right answer as it comes to exhibits, and probably as it comes to life. You really have to think about what are these different possibilities and perspectives. So that's actually a really good example of how that can play out in a practical way in your practice, your development practice.
Yeah, I remember reading about something that was developed at the Exploratorium a bunch of years ago, the notion of juicy questions, and that the working definition for me of that phrase is that it's a question for which you do not have the answer, and that there likely isn't an answer.
Or at least not a sort of obvious answer.
There are probably 40
Yeah, exactly.
obvious answers depending on who's answering.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, I'm wondering if you have an example. I'll put you on the spot of where a project sort of didn't play out the way you had hoped because of this
Mistakes were
crashing
made.
into complexity or avoidance of complexity.
Hmm. Well, I have looked at. It's easiest for me to answer it for specific components. We, I really wanted something having to do with a real tree core for a project we did at an arboretum, and that you get a sense of what a ring is, but from a completely different geometric perspective, because a core is like a dowel, although they tend to do this after they dry. And it just kept failing and failing and failing. And we finally said, okay, we'll just do a photograph. We'll do it graphically, and have a bar that goes across that you can use to count the ring moments. And it was completely incomprehensible. Nobody had a freaking clue. And I think the key is, and they ended up abandoning it, a year or so after the exhibit opened, and it probably cost them, I don't know, $2 or $3 grand with the phenolic and the hardware and the blah blah blah, all that stuff. And I really wanted that, and it was part of the problem, was trying to reduce a very complex set of ideas to it didn't work at all. It was dumb.
Yeah. Well, and that might be a good way to leave off and to just acknowledge that not every complex set of ideas or complex phenomena can be simply reduced. I mean, I think that's what obviously came out from your example there, but I think there are other examples, and especially if we get into conversations about human behavior or societal issues that are even more complex, they tend not to be so neatly reduced. Otherwise, they wouldn't be issues or challenges anymore. So,
True. Well, and I'm not making an argument against simplicity, because I think that addressing something complicated doesn't have to itself be complicated or expensive or breakable. I mean, it's not that it, yes, that's a problem. That's a complexity, but that I think we're all always trying to figure out how can we do this simply, affordably, robustly, um, but allow for the range of possible, the widest range of possible interpretation, uh, approaches, learning styles, you name it.
well, I appreciate that you put the spotlight on complexity today because I think that in our in our searching for things to be robust and simple, the trick is yes, simple, but not too simple, I suppose. So, well, thanks very much, Aaron. Thanks for sharing
Thank you.
just one thing about exhibits with complexity. That's great.
And it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Paul.
Thank you. Take care.